Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the podcast where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, Rebecca Ikes-Kara.
I'm going to cut to the chase. I'm hosting a free live webinar called The 4 Most Common Instagram Photography Mistakes. And, of course, how to avoid them. Yes, even with your cell phone. It's going to be on January 18th and 19th, 2022. Welcome to the new year. I only do this webinar maybe twice a year. I haven't done it since June of 2021, if that tells you anything. So if you want to kickstart 2022 with some immediately better photography, even if you're just taking photos with your cell phone, then this webinar is for you. In the first 15 minutes, you'll already have tricks to improve, and nothing requires buying new gear or equipment. I promise. If you're interested, you can sign up by going to makersplaybook.com/Instagram-photography. All right, on with the show. Since it had been about 6 months since my photography extravaganza here on the podcast, towards the end of last year, I got to thinking that it was probably about time for another one. I've been preparing the ideas behind these next 2 weeks of podcast episodes, focused on some of the most common questions I get emailed and DM'd about photography for a while now. So when Kurt ended our conversation last week by saying one of his greatest pieces of advice to people is to take a photography course, I practically spit out my tea as we were recording. I couldn't have planned for a better segue. But he's right, you know. If you want to share your work online and hopefully sell that work online, you have to have good photos. I Googled tips for how to sell ceramics online, and nearly every single article I saw on the first page of Google at least includes the importance of the photos. You need the photos to display the same colors as your glazes in real life. You need people to understand the scale of the piece. Because let's be honest, reading a description that tells me a mug is 4 inches in diameter does not tell me whether or not it's going to feel good in my hands. And you also need potential buyers to envision your piece so much that they just have to hit the buy button. Photography can be overwhelming if you don't have an efficient system for it. But it is possible to have an efficient system. And if you don't believe me on that, because you've probably totally exhausted and frustrated by all of the Google results so far, well, today on the podcast, I've asked a few past students to share their experiences.
My name is Justice Isa October Joseph, and I picked up ceramics in January of 2019. So a year before the pandemic. I took a couple classes, fell in love with clay, and decided I wanted to turn it into a business. I formed Isa October and began to essentially post my progress. I split my time between making clay and training dogs, which is my other passion. And I have a pack of special needs animals and do fostering of special needs animals for local rescues here in Chicago. And my other part of my time goes towards dealing with my chronic illness.
Did you have any semblance of kind of a process before we started working together?
So I have this collection of, again, I'm going to use those air quotes, backdrops. Mm-hmm. I tried poster boards and beautiful wrapping papers. And so I had this kind of Mod Podge mix of things that I would kind of bring out. And then, I had read that you were supposed to do it near a window. So the other thing is when I think you had I can't even remember. It was like a little preview thing that wasn't even the course. It was just before. It was free. It was probably in one of your newsletters.
Or it could have been the webinar that we're actually doing again.
That was yep. Oh my gosh, that was amazing. I got so much out of that webinar, even from the start, explaining the window thing that I was doing absolutely wrong because nobody had broken it down with the pictures. Nobody had ever actually sat there and explained what happens with the light. It was either they didn't know what they were talking about or they were too immersed in it to actually break it down into the steps that somebody could really grasp onto and understand.
I find that that happens so... Actually, I love that you gave both examples, but I never say the first one because I feel like I can't. But I find the second one especially happens so much if it is a professional photographer trying to teach people, and especially trying to teach generically. It's just so filled with jargon and terminology. And it's like, hold on a second. People might not know what an f-stop is. So you talking about all this stuff doesn't help.
Yeah, all of that. So I had that sort of Mod Podge mix of I'm trying and nothing's quite working. And I only have my iPhone. And a lot of them, again, we're talking like just what you mentioned. Set your f-stop to such and such. Change your exposure to such and such. And I just had a new iPhone. I got the iPhone 12 and I barely knew how to work it at all. And I think even in the webinar, you started mentioning things that changed my life. Just how to use my phone camera. Just as a starting base. Those were huge.
And do you still mostly use your phone?
Yeah, I still do not have a real camera. I only use my phone, but my photos are so much better. So let's talk a little bit about the system that you set up with this course. I have such an easy system now. I have a spot in my studio where all of my stuff exists. I have the props that work with that style that I have, that kind of dark macabre. I've collected some things that make a lot of sense, that show the size of things. It's so much more helpful. And I can take pictures of my stuff in like 10 minutes now, which is crazy. Whereas before I would also spend like hours hours trying to get just a couple photos. And in retrospect, they're so terrible. I didn't know what I was doing. I can see my effort. If you go through my Instagram, you can tell the day I discovered you.
I love it.
My name is Jessica, and I am in Cincinnati, Ohio. I work full-time from home with a computer job, and so I started doing ceramics. I actually just took a class with a couple of friends at a local studio for fun, and then just got really interested in it, and it was a really good kind of balance from my work to something more creative and with my hands and getting out of the house.
What was your approach then as you were getting started? How were you trying to manage the photography side of things?
I wasn't really thinking about it too much. I would take pictures of things in my hand that down in front of me, or I'd try to put something on a stump in my backyard or in front of a flower in my backyard or something, and I had no idea how to even think about lighting or what else is in the spot, or making sure the piece is level even.
So you mentioned kind of not really thinking that much about the photography process before. So what would be the big difference now, from then to now, if you will?
Well, first is definitely lighting. I thought it needed to be daylight, no clouds, as bright as possible. And that really, I guess, washes out the pieces more than I realized. And so having the light come from a specific direction, whether it's 90 degrees or 60 degrees, that helps a lot. And I wouldn't have known to do that before.
You're just using this with your windows at home now, right?
I'll either do the windows or I'll shoot at night with a lamp. Luckily, it has a really nice light that comes out of it. I didn't get a specific bulb, but the one that works happens to work well. So it depends on what it is. I think planters I like to do in the daylight because it's kind of a happy kind of daytime thing. And mugs and stuff, they look nice in the nighttime, or the luminaries that I make too. They're great to do at night.
That's exactly. I was thinking of those luminaries because you have such a candlelight feel sometimes now with those, which is a completely different feeling than your planters, and yet side by side those photos go together.
Yeah, and I would have never thought about that. Even the mood of the picture I would have never thought about before taking the course, and realizing that's something that you should think about. And the one prop guidance was also really helpful to think of what can I put in the shot that will help not only make it visually more appealing, but also represent the scale correctly. And before, I wasn't doing that. And then I also wasn't paying attention to what was in the shot. So there could be like something half in and half out of the shot, or like some like junk in the background. And that's like really distracting to the eye.
How do you then set up now? Because, you know, for some people they think, oh, I don't have a beautiful kitchen, or they only have the basement studio with the wood paneling. So what's your kind of setup now, your go-to thing?
So I have a little table in my sunroom, and it has the tablecloth on it, like the tie-dye tablecloth that I use for my backdrop. And then I have the other ones kind of just there on the side. And when I'm going to take pictures, I just put this piece of plywood up to block the window that's behind the table. And then I clamp the cloth to that, and I set it up on there.
That's awesome. So it's super fast.
Super fast, yeah. And I put the pieces as far up from the table as possible so I can get the nice blurry background. And then I'll put the pot in the spot, especially if I'm doing like 10 planners or something. I'll put it in the spot. Maybe I'll put like the extras in the back or whatever little prop on the side. And then I just do one, I take it down, do the next one, and it's way faster. And it's like actually fun. And I feel like I know what I'm doing. And I'm like happy with it.
Okay, just one more student introduction before we move on to more of the details on how to build the system for yourself. I wanted to share all of these stories with you because I want you to realize that the students we've had in the Makers Photography Styling System literally span the globe. They are full-time makers and side hustlers, retired and finally coming back to their love of pottery from a couple of decades ago, and makers who only just touched clay for the first time a couple of years ago. There are cell phone only photographers and some people using this course to finally dust off that digital camera they always thought that they'd use. But most of all, and something we're going to dig into even more next week, each and every single one of our students have wound up with radically different photographic styles that suit not only their personalities, but their work as well. Okay, but before we dig into crafting your own style, we have to talk about getting you an efficient system first. So let's hear from Linda, and then we're going to dig into how we can systematize and speed up your photography.
My name is Linda Wells, and I have a business called Wells Works Pottery. I live on Whidbey Island outside of Seattle, Washington State. It's a beautiful place. I love to garden. I'm retired, so I have a pottery hobby business. I first learned how to do ceramics in the 70s. I learned how to throw in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Museum, which was a wonderful place to learn. And then I gave it up for over 40 years. And so I'm back into my new life in pottery. It's about 5 or 6 years now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And before we met, what was kind of the way you approach sharing your work? Were you posting that much online, or?
I was trying to post online. I do have an Instagram account and I have a Facebook account. And I love to watch everybody else's journey in pottery and gardening on Instagram. That's what I use it for. And so I thought I would participate a little bit and maybe get a couple of followers, which is about all I have. That's okay with me. Yep. And so I started taking pictures of my pottery and my flowers to put on Instagram. I had much better luck with my flowers because they're easier to photograph.
They're much more forgiving. Yeah.
I wasn't really happy with the way my pots looked online, so I didn't post as many pictures as I took. Mm-hmm. Put it that way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's the case for so many people, right? Is that it's like, okay, I want to do this and I should do this, but then you look at the pictures and go, I don't really want to put that on the internet.
Right. It's like, you don't want to be embarrassed. There's a little bit of ego involved in that, even though you're completely anonymous to the world.
Absolutely.
You don't want to put anything out there that you're not proud of. And you might be proud of the piece of pottery, but if you have to keep telling people, oh, it looks so much better in person, what's the point?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I don't sell online. I only sell at local markets and festivals.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't that motivated to build an anticipation for a shop opening or anything like that.
Do you feel like now, though, having shared your work more online this year, do you think that made a difference going into your December sales that you had so much success with?
I think it did, because I have built up more of a local following. Mm-hmm. And being able to present my current work online in a good light made them want to come and see it and maybe buy something. And if somebody has seen my work online, and I've had a couple of people say to me, do you still have that piece? I said, well, no, that sold yesterday. You should have been here yesterday. Right?
But that's a wonderful feedback to get, to know directly that people are seeing it online and then they're seeing you in person. That's the most direct connection a marketer could ever ask for.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, what did you do before we worked together? What was kind of the approach you had for photography, if you had one?
So I never had any formal photography training or anything except point the camera at my children and take a picture and tell them to smile. So when I started taking pictures of my pottery, it was a whole new learning experience. I had been looking online at photographs for a while of different potters and their approaches. And in the community studio where I was participating at the time, we did have a couple of sessions where we put our pots in the light boxes with a whole white background and took pictures of them. And that was really fun, but I wasn't really happy with the way the pictures looked. Mm-hmm. So now I have one spot where I like to take my pictures. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so the light here is not predictable. Mm-hmm. I love taking pictures of my pottery now. Yeah. So in the course, I learned from you about direction of light and how to just reflect it back on the pottery and how to make a, how do I say this, focus setting. Mm-hmm. So that your props were in the right spot. The most important thing I learned from you was about awkward intersections, if that's what you called it, where the pot handle just awkwardly hits something in the background and looked weird. Yep. So I'm always going, awkward intersections. Do I have one? Where's that handle lining up?
Yep.
And about how to use your props and where to put them. And it's something you have to practice. It doesn't come naturally. Mm-hmm. But you make it really easy to follow. And I printed out all your notes, and I have them in a book. And I look at that book often.
Yes.
And say, oh, what did I do wrong? How do I fix that? And there it is. Rebecca's got the answer for me.
So, what's the key to this system? Well, as you can hear from these past students, we got way more into depth on the entire thing from start to finish in the Makers Photography styling system. But I hope you also know by now, after a year's worth of podcast episodes, I'm not going to leave you hanging. First up, if you're getting exhausted by listening to photography tips without a visual aid, because after all, photography is a visual thing, well, that's exactly why I'm hosting that free live webinar I mentioned at the start of this episode. So go ahead and hit pause and reserve yourself a seat for either January 18th or 19th by clicking the link in the show notes on whatever podcast app you're listening to us on, or by visiting makersplaybook.com/Instagram-photography. In the meantime, today, I'm going to share the Cliff Notes version of that system. Basically the version that you can listen to without all the visual aids. But just like the real Cliff Notes, you'll miss out on all the juicy details, all the amazing character development that truly makes you love a story. But you'll at least be able to fake your way through the conversation with the teacher. For now. All right, so first things first. Let's dispel a very common myth that I get emailed about at least once a week. The type of camera you use. The type of camera you use has very, very little to do with how good your photos are. All right, now, caveat. If you're going from the first edition iPhone to the new iPhone 13, obviously you're going to see a difference. Your brain might explode a little bit. But if we're talking about the differences between the iPhone 11 to the 13, or a digital camera that was made within the last 3 to 5 years even, and buying the newest one that just came out yesterday, I'm sorry to tell you, it's not the camera. Here's the system. What makes a good photo? Particularly if we are defining good photo, I'm doing air quotes over here, for the sake of this conversation, we're going to define that with respect to taking photographs of ceramics or other art that we make for the purpose of sharing it on the internet, something like Instagram or your website or your Etsy store, and possibly selling that work on the internet. Using that definition, then, what makes a good photo is intentional lighting and strong composition. Now, of course, there are numerous details wrapped up in how you get to intentional lighting and strong composition. But trying to teach you about those things is much easier with that visual aid, rather than an audio-only podcast. So, I'm going to assume you know what I'm about to say. Yes, you should come join me on the free live webinar, The Foremost Common Instagram Photography Mistakes. In fact, before we go any further, once again, you might as well wipe the mud off your hands, hit pause on this episode, and just click the link in the show notes of your podcasting app. Go ahead and reserve your seat. I'll wait. Because I'm real sure you don't want me to continuously interrupt these tips to remind you about the free live webinar called The Foremost Common Instagram Photography Mistakes and How to Avoid Them, Even with Your Cell Phone, that I'm hosting on January 18th and 19th. You see what I did there? Oh man, the most self-conscious thing about these solo episodes is never knowing if my jokes actually land and anyone else is laughing. It's just radio silence over on this side of the microphone and Hendrix snoring in the background. Alright, so back to the photography system. The basics of a good photo, regardless of your camera, are intentional lighting and strong composition. Now, where different kinds of cameras will affect the quality of your photos, like going from that iPhone 7 to the iPhone 13, will be in how many mistakes you can get away with. Alright? Because as I've just heard, the iPhone 13 lets you change your focal point. If your photo's not in focus in the right spot, and the fact that you can change that later, that's just crazy to me. But you'd save yourself a step if it was in focus in the first place, right? So, if you don't yet have an understanding also of the direction of light, for example, then a stronger, newer, better camera will maybe help cover up some of those missing pieces of information or those errors when the lighting is less than ideal. Maybe you notice with the new camera, your photos look brighter than they did before. Well, if you were trying to photograph your favorite new mug straight out of the kiln and set it directly in front of a window with the window behind your mug, and on your old phone your mug always looked too dark, but now on your new phone it's brighter, I'm going to take a bet that the entire photo is brighter, isn't it? I bet that the window behind your mug, you can no longer see what was outside on the other side of that window. But it's probably just all white. Nothing actually changed about the camera, except it got a little bit smarter at adjusting your exposure for the mug instead of exposing for the window. If you instead stood so that the window was to the side of your mug, like perpendicular with your shoulder, if you're in front of the mug to photograph it, and then you took that photo, it would look practically the same on the old phone and the new phone. Okay, so I know you probably don't want to learn all of the ins and outs of lighting, because after all, you mostly just want a decent photo as quickly as possible so you can get back to your making. So this might sound like a plausible reason to go out and buy that iPhone 13. But before we give Apple even more of our money than we already have, consider for me that all I suggested to fix your problem was to turn 90 degrees. Instead of photographing your mug right in front of a window, I want you to photograph it with the window to the side of your mug, perpendicular. That's it. These are the kind of quick, simple fixes I'm talking about when I'm saying this webinar is the 4 most common photography mistakes and how to avoid them. I know you don't want all the photography jargon of f-stops and apertures and shutter speeds. I mean, what the heck does ISO even stand for, right? You don't need to know all that stuff to take a good photo of your work. At least not if I'm explaining it to you. But don't take my word for it. After all, I am totally biased and clearly want you to go visit makersplaybook.com/Instagram-photography and pop your email address into the form to join me on the free webinar. So let's hear a little bit more from some of our past students about how they were able to harness the system that we're talking about of intentional lighting and strong composition.
I feel braver about trying things. Like, feel braver about making mistakes and not worrying. It's funny because you can learn this thing and learn how to make things better, and somehow that makes me less worried about getting things wrong. And it's not because I'm going to get it right. It's just that I know that every photo I take, I will learn from it now and like consciously be able to learn from it. All of the practice, we did so much practice in the course about looking at photos and looking at them in so many different ways, whether it's the grid. We talked a lot about the Z or Z shape. We talked about so many things that just even after a photo is taken, I can go back and reanalyze it and understand that photo better and what works and what I could improve on for next time or what I might change just to get a different sort of personality coming out in it.
So what do you feel like your process is like?
Generally, when I'm taking photos, I have just one background that I use. So I take out my background and they are flooring pieces, laminate flooring pieces.
I didn't
from
even
Home
think
Depot.
of that. I love it.
$3 a tile.
Fantastic.
And I just prop one up against the wall and then the other one goes on the ground. And I bring my light over and I don't even have a special, like I've got nothing special. Went to Home Depot and pulled out some floor tiles. My lamp is actually just a lamp I used at my studio desk to do my work. And then I take out my prop box and figure out what would be most illuminating to use with the props. I usually like to do my individual shots first. And I pretty much created a shot list for myself. And I can add or take away as I feel inspired, but it's pretty much like a little checklist. Like, oh, I want one that, is from above, from the side, from like all sides. It's pretty much like a 360 kind of thing. And then I play. And I'm like, put it in a scene, have it in my hand, try with different props. And I also actually, one of the things that I did buy that is specialized, but really cheap. I got one of those gooseneck phone holders. And that, oh my gosh, not having to hold my phone has been amazing, which is definitely a tip I picked up during the course. I photograph always with the grid on my phone as well. And I have these little printout references of the shapes that are nice to make. Yeah, it's just all there. It's so easy. It's so fast now. Pretty much just running through my checklist.
How long do you feel like it takes you now to do that?
My gingerbread, I was done in about 15 minutes, which blew my mind because I had 26 of them.
Oh my gosh. That's faster than I am.
It's so fast.
Love it.
It was so fast. I realized I might have just made it sound really boring because I have a checklist. I have so much fun doing it. It's really playful. The whole having kind of the framework where I know it looks like I want it to look like, I have so much more time to play and try things out. I think that's what I was saying about not being afraid. Before, I'd be very concerned about, I have to get this right. Now I'm like, I'm going to get 5 things right. Let's just play and see what else I might come up with. And sometimes I end up with a camera roll full of terrible photos, but most of the time, they're not that terrible. They're even good. And some of them make me especially happy. So taking photos now, instead of being like, I have to get these posted on Etsy, it's really an opportunity to play with the stuff I've created in my studio.
A friend gave me a tripod and an adapter for my iPhone and a little remote control for my iPhone camera. Because some of the places where I'm taking pictures, there's hardly any space for me, let alone me holding a camera.
Yep.
And just because I'm following the light in the house sometimes. And it's so great. I love it. I absolutely love it.
So before there wasn't a system, there wasn't an approach, you were just kind of looking online and trying to match. So what is it like now if you open up a kiln and have a batch of pots to take photos of?
Okay. Now I bring them into my kitchen because I have no natural light in my studio. I have it in the summertime when I open my garage doors, but not all year round. So I bring them into the kitchen where the light is more predictable. And I know exactly where I'm going to take the pictures because I figured that out with your help. And I set up my backdrop and my surface. And I pull out a couple of props that I use all the time because that makes it easier. I have little olive oil bottles that are pretty shapes. And I know exactly where to put the pot because I figured out how far from the background I need to be. And I have a process. I have a process that I didn't have before, steps that I follow. And I still play with it. I play with the distance from the background. I play a little bit with the angle of the light, whether I'm going to take a shot straight forward or from up a little higher. I haven't played with flat lays yet, but that's in my future because I've made a lot of platters. And so it's so much easier. I don't have to wonder about how am I going to do this? How am I going to approach this? It's not as intimidating as it was, and it's not as frustrating as it was. I don't feel frustrated at all anymore. It's kind of fun.
So here's the moral of the story in all of this. Photography has a lot of variables. That's part of what makes it so darn overwhelming. And I hope that as you've heard these students discuss their experiences, you are hearing that it is possible to simplify all of those variables. If you're trying to figure out every single aspect all at once, all by yourself, it's no wonder it feels impossible. It's pretty crucial to harness each variable one step at a time, but also in the right kind of order, so that you can actually see yourself making improvements. That's why I wanted to distill all of this down today into 2 main points for you to focus on: intentional lighting and strong compositions. We're going to dive deeper, particularly on the compositional side of things in the webinar, since frankly, I really couldn't think of a way to discuss a visual skill in an audio-only podcast. So you'll just have to join me on either January 18th or 19th for that. But next week here on the podcast, we'll be talking more about harnessing that light in finding your unique photographic style. Until next week,
Go get back to making your dreams a reality, because together, we've got this.